The day Eliza Calloway rode into the sun-scorched town of Dust Creek, New Mexico Territory, in the spring of 1882, every soul on the main street stopped what they were doing and stared, because a woman who carried herself like a queen had no business stepping down from a stagecoach into a place like that. She descended the iron step with one gloved hand resting lightly on the coach door, and the other holding the brim of her traveling hat against the warm April wind. Her dress was a deep plum wool, a little road-worn at the hem but clearly once fine, and she moved through the settling dust as though the dust had been placed there specifically for her to walk across. The men leaning against the post outside the general store straightened without knowing why. The women pausing near the water trough found reasons to linger. Even old Hector Gibbs, who drove the stage and who had been driving stages for 21 years and considered himself immune to nearly everything, watched her in his rearview thoughts long after he had climbed back up to his seat. Dust Creek was not the kind of town that inspired confidence. It had one street of consequence, a crooked row of buildings that included a livery, a general store run by the Whitmore family, a saloon called the Copper Spur, a small post office that doubled as the telegraph office, a barber shop, a doctor's office that smelled of iodine and old wood, a modest church at the far end, and a hotel of sorts called the Sadler House that had 6 rooms and a communal washroom. The territory had been throwing settlers westward for a decade, and Dust Creek existed because of the silver deposits in the hills 15 miles north, deposits that had drawn enough people to warrant a town, though the town had never quite decided if it wanted to become something real or remain a temporary collection of intentions. Eliza had come because of a letter. She had received it in St. Louis, Missouri, where she had been employed as a schoolteacher in a private home, tutoring the 3 children of a railroad merchant named Aldridge. The letter had come from a lawyer named Gerald Prentice, informing her that her late uncle, a man named Howard Calloway, whom she had not seen in 11 years and had barely known growing up, had died without a direct heir and had left her a property in the New Mexico Territory. The property was described in the legal correspondence as a ranch of approximately 400 acres with a main house, 2 outbuildings, a well, and a small herd of cattle whose number the lawyer rather vaguely described as adequate. What the lawyer had not mentioned, Eliza would shortly discover, was that the main house had a collapsed rear wall, the well required new rope and a new bucket assembly. One of the outbuildings had partially burned at some point, and the cattle numbered exactly 31, of which 6 were in questionable health. She had accepted the inheritance anyway. She was 24 years old, practical by nature if not entirely by choice, and the alternative was to continue teaching the Aldridge children arithmetic and penmanship in a city that felt increasingly like a life happening to someone else. She had a small amount of savings, enough intelligence to ask useful questions, and a stubbornness she had inherited from her father's side of the family and had spent her whole life trying to diplomatically disguise. She stood now in the street with her 2 traveling trunks beside her and looked at Dust Creek with the quiet, assessing gaze of someone who has already decided to make the best of things and is now simply cataloging the inventory. "You looking for somebody, ma'am?" She turned. A young boy of perhaps 10 or 11 was standing near her trunks with his hands in his overall pockets and an expression of tremendous helpfulness on his face. "I am looking for the Sadler House," she said, "and after that I am looking for a lawyer named Gerald Prentice." "Prentice has his office above the post office," the boy said. "Sadler House is right there." He pointed to a building 30 feet away with a hand-painted sign above the door that had faded to the point where the lettering required some imagination to read. "You want me to help with those trunks? I charge 2 cents a trunk." "That is entirely reasonable," Eliza said, and the boy's face lit up. She had been in her room at the Sadler House for approximately 40 minutes, washing the road dust from her face and hands and pinning her hair back into order, when she heard the commotion in the street below. It was not violent, but it was loud, the kind of loud that suggested a disagreement between people who were both convinced they were right and neither of whom was prepared to lower their voice. She went to the window and looked down. There were two men in the street below. One of them was a heavy, red-faced man in a town suit who was gesturing with considerable energy at the other man. The other man was leaning against a post with his arms folded and his hat pulled low, listening to the red-faced man with the perfect stillness of someone who has decided that responding would be a waste of effort. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, and his coat was a brown canvas duster that had seen better decades. The left elbow was patched with a different material entirely, and there was a tear along the lower right side that had been sewn up with thread that did not match, and the cuffs were frayed in the way that comes not from one day's hard use but from years of it. His boots, she could see even from the second floor, were similarly well used. His hat had a sweat-darkened band and a small dent in the crown that appeared structural rather than accidental. She watched him for a moment. He was clearly, she thought, a man of very little means. A drifter perhaps, or a ranch hand fallen on hard times, the kind of man the West produced in abundance, men who worked themselves lean and threadbare for wages that never quite added up to enough. She felt a pang of something she might have called sympathy and turned away from the window. She did not yet know his name. His name was Cole Whitaker, and he was not poor. He was, in fact, the owner of the largest functioning ranch in the county, a spread of 1,200 acres called the Iron Cross that sat 7 miles north of Dusk Creek, and had been built by his father and grandfather across 40 years of extraordinary effort. He ran 540 cattle, employed 8 full-time hands, had a comfortable main house with 4 rooms and a covered porch, and had approximately $3,000 in the Wells Fargo Bank in Santa Fe, a sum that in 1882 represented more security than 90% of the men in New Mexico Territory would see in their lifetimes. The coat was simply the coat he liked. He had owned it for 8 years. It had been with him through 2 cattle drives, a brutal winter that froze the Rio Hondo solid for 3 weeks, the death of his father, and 100 ordinary days that had somehow accumulated into the particular shape of his life. His housekeeper, a stout and opinionated woman named Mrs. Cordero, had offered to replace it 7 times. He had declined 7 times. The coat fit him the way his own thoughts did, without binding. The red-faced man he was listening to was Douglas Fenwick, who owned the Copper Spur Saloon, and who had been trying for 2 years to purchase a strip of land on the eastern edge of the Iron Cross that would give him access to a road that bypassed the main town route. Cole had no interest in selling. Fenwick had no interest in accepting that answer. They had this conversation roughly once a month, and it always ended the same way, with Fenwick red and gesticulating and Cole quiet and immovable. "You are an unreasonable man," Fenwick said, for what Cole estimated was the 13th or 14th time across all their conversations. "I have been called worse," Cole said pleasantly, and pushed off the post and walked away. He was heading toward the general store, which was where he had been heading when Fenwick intercepted him. He needed salt, 2 spools of wire and lamp oil, and he had promised his hand Miguel that he would check on the order for a replacement axle that had been due from Albuquerque for 2 weeks. He was 3 steps from the general store door when he nearly walked directly into Eliza Calloway. She had come down from the Sadler house and was crossing the street with the purpose of someone who has a list of things to accomplish and is already thinking about the second item on the list. He stopped. She stopped. They were close enough that he could see the exact color of her eyes, which were a very clear gray with a dark ring around the iris, the kind of eyes that seemed to be doing something more active than simply looking. "Pardon me, ma'am," he said, stepping back and touching the brim of his hat. "No, the fault is mine," she said, and her voice was steady and cultivated, the voice of someone educated, and it struck him immediately, because voices like that did not usually come attached to women stepping out of hotels in Dusk Creek. "I was not paying sufficient attention to where I was going." "No harm done," he said. He looked at her. He registered in the way a person registers the quality of unexpected light, simply remarkable looking. Not pretty in the easy, agreeable way that some women were pretty, but striking, with cheekbones that suggested strong ancestry and a composure that seemed to come from the inside out rather than from effort. She wore her gloves and her plum dress and her hat as though they were entirely natural extensions of herself, and she stood in the dusty street of Dusk Creek the way a woman stands in a place she owns, not with arrogance but with a settled certainty. Rich, he thought, definitely rich, passing through probably, or here to assess some investment. The kind of woman who has other people to manage the difficult parts of things. He was entirely wrong about every one of those conclusions. "Are you perhaps familiar with this town?" she asked. "I am newly arrived and looking for the office of Gerald Prentice." "Above the post office," he said. "Down the street, left side, the building with the blue door, stairs on the outside." "Thank you," she said, and her smile was brief and genuine and entirely without performance, and he watched her walk away, and then stood there for a moment longer than was strictly necessary before going into the general store. Inside, Marcus Whitmore, who ran the store with his wife and 2 daughters, was leaning on the counter and had an expression that suggested he had also been watching the street. "Know who that woman is?" Marcus asked. "No," Cole said. "Howard Calloway's niece. She inherited the Calloway place." Cole looked at him. "Howard Calloway's place is in rough shape." "I know it," Marcus said. "Roof on the main house went in the winter before last. Back walls not much better." "She doesn't look like a woman who's come out here for a vacation." "No," Cole said slowly, "she does not." Gerald Prentice was a narrow man in his 50s with excellent posture and the careful, apologetic manner of someone who delivers bad news professionally. He had the Calloway property papers laid out on his desk when Eliza arrived, and he went through them with the thoroughness of a man who wants it clearly established that he personally is not responsible for the condition of the property he is describing. "The main house is structurally sound at the front," he said, "but the rear section suffered significant collapse due to winter snow load. It is, in my assessment, habitable in the front 2 rooms if some basic repairs are made." "And the cattle?" Eliza asked. 31 head as of my last count, which was 3 weeks ago. Mr. Torres from the neighboring property has been keeping an eye on them, but he has not been compensated for this service, and I would suggest you address that promptly." "I intend to," Eliza said. Prentice looked at her over his spectacles with the expression of a man recalibrating. "Miss Calloway, I want to be direct with you. The property requires substantial investment to become viable as a working ranch. The well needs repair. The fencing along the north pasture is failing. The barn is the best structure on the property, which is perhaps not a recommendation. Do you have resources beyond the property itself?" "Some," she said carefully. "Enough to begin." This was not entirely accurate. She had $112.30 in savings, which had seemed adequate for a modest start when she was considering the proposition from St. Louis, and which felt considerably less adequate now that the proposition had specific dollar amounts attached to it. "I would suggest," Prentice said, "that you consider speaking with some of the established ranchers in the area. The community here is, on the whole, decent. Cole Whittaker, for instance, runs the Iron Cross north of town. He has been in this territory his whole life and knows the land and the business." "I will bear that in mind," Eliza said. She rode out to the Calloway property the next morning on a horse she hired from the livery, a sensible bay mare named Pepper who seemed to have a philosophical disposition toward carrying strangers across difficult terrain. The road was more of a suggestion than a road, and for a mile it was simply a pair of wagon tracks through dry grass that was just beginning to show the first green of spring. The house, when she saw it, was exactly as bad as Prentice had described, and approximately 40% worse than she had emotionally prepared for. The front section had 2 rooms and a lean-to kitchen attached at the side, and if she tilted her head and squinted slightly, she could believe these were livable. The rear section was another matter. The roof had come down and taken part of the back wall with it, and the whole thing now presented to the sky in a way that suggested defeat. The porch ran along the front and was actually sound, which she took as the optimism of the situation. She walked through the front rooms. There were two narrow windows with no glass in them, just wooden shutters that latched from the inside. There was a stone fireplace with a mantel that had a crack in it. There was a wooden floor, rough-cut planks that were solid if not elegant. She went to the well and tested the windlass, which ground and stuck at the midpoint of its rotation. She walked the north fence line for a quarter-mile and found 3 sections that were down completely. She went back to the porch and sat on the step and looked at the landscape, which was, whatever else could be said, genuinely magnificent. The hills rolled westward toward distant mountains that were still snow-capped, and the sky above them was the particular shade of blue that she had never seen in Missouri, a blue so deep and clear, it seemed almost aggressive in its beauty. She sat there for 20 minutes and made decisions. She would stay in Dust Creek for the time being and work on the house enough to make it livable. She would sell 3 or 4 of the weaker cattle to cover immediate costs. She would hire whatever help she could afford for the well and the fence. She would teach herself what she did not know, and she would ask questions of people who did know, because pride was an indulgence she could not currently afford. She rode back to town with the practical calm of someone who has made their peace with a large and difficult thing. Cole Whitaker was at the livery when she returned Pepper for the evening. How was it? He asked because Marcus Whitmore had mentioned that morning that the Calloway woman had gone out to look at the property, and Cole had ridden into town on other business and found himself, without quite deciding to, waiting to hear. Eliza looked at him. He was leaning against the livery door with his worn coat and his battered hat, and she thought again, with the automatic assessment that poverty makes unavoidable in the people who witness it, that here was a man who understood hard circumstance. She felt an odd kinship with him for that reason. It is as described, she said, possibly more so. The well's a 2-day job if you know what you're doing, he said. It's on the north, probably needs a week. You going to hire it out? I am going to have to, she said. Do you know anyone who does this kind of work for fair wages? He looked at her for a moment. I might be able to spare a couple of my hands for a few days. The spring drive doesn't start for 3 weeks. She regarded him with the careful attention of someone who suspects generosity and wants to understand its source before accepting it. That is very kind. I would pay them, of course. Of course, he said. And may I ask your name? We have spoken twice now without introductions. Cole Whitaker, he said. I run the Iron Cross. Eliza Calloway, she said, and extended her hand, which caught him slightly off guard because women in 1882 New Mexico territory did not always extend their hands for shaking, but he took it, and her grip was firm and unself-conscious. I knew your uncle slightly, he said. He was a private man. He was, she said. We were not close, but I find myself grateful to him. For the property. For the reason to come here, she said, and it was so simply and directly spoken that it took him a moment to absorb it, and by the time he had, she had already thanked him for the offer of hands and walked toward the Sadler house. He stood in the livery doorway and watched the street after she had gone, and the livery owner, a taciturn man named Earl Bates, came up beside him and said nothing for a while. You're going to go help her yourself, aren't you? Earl said. I said I'd send a couple of hands. That's not what I asked. Cole looked at him sideways and then went to get his horse. He sent 2 of his best hands, a quiet, capable man named Santiago, and a younger hand named Pete, who was 22 and enthusiastic about any task that was not fence mending, which was unfortunate given that fence mending was the primary task required. They went out to the Calloway property on Wednesday morning, and Cole went with them on the grounds that he needed to assess the well himself, because Santiago was good with cattle and horses but not particularly experienced with well mechanics. This was true as far as it went. They arrived to find Eliza already at the property, having ridden Pepper out at dawn. She had brought tools from town and a coil of new rope for the well, and she had also, improbably, brought a pot of coffee, which she had somehow managed to brew over a small fire built in the fireplace, because the flue, at least, was clear. "I wasn't sure when you would arrive," she said, handing Cole a tin cup of coffee that was black and strong and better than anything he had tasted that week. "I hope this is acceptable." "Better than acceptable," he said honestly. Pete and Santiago exchanged a look behind Cole's back that communicated a significant amount of information in a brief glance. They worked through the morning. Cole took apart the well assembly with the methodical efficiency of a man who has done this before, though it had been 10 years since he had worked on a well with his own hands, rather than directing someone else to do it. He found the problem: a cracked wooden pulley housing and a fraying section of the original rope that had been spliced badly at some point in the past. He replaced both. By midday, the well was drawing clean water from 20 feet down. Eliza, who had been watching the well repair while simultaneously attempting to organize the front rooms of the house with broom and muscle and considerable determination, came to look when she heard the water come up. She lowered the new bucket and raised it, and the water ran over the side of it in the good, solid way of water that has not been interrupted. "Oh," she said softly, and the single syllable carried enough feeling that Cole looked at her face and saw something unguarded there, something that was not the composed, self-possessed woman of the street and the lawyer's office, but something younger and more vulnerable, the expression of someone who has been carrying a weight so steadily that they have forgotten to notice it until the moment it becomes slightly less heavy. "Good water," he said quietly. "Yes," she said, and then straightened and was herself again, practical and clear-eyed. "Thank you, sincerely." They ate a midday meal on the porch, such as it was, Eliza having also brought bread and dried beef and apples from the store, and they sat in the spring warmth and Pete talked too much, as Pete always did, and Santiago said very little, as Santiago always did, and Cole found himself simply watching Eliza, not in any obvious way, but with the focused attention of someone trying to understand something they have not encountered before. She was educated, that was clear. She spoke with precision and had a vocabulary that suggested reading beyond what most people in New Mexico territory had access to. But she was not soft. She had worked that morning alongside them without complaining, and without the performance of working that some people put on when they want to be seen to be capable. She had simply done what needed doing, quietly and with competence, and she had figured out the broom situation with the front room fireplace entirely on her own, which had required some ingenuity given the amount of debris that had accumulated. She asked intelligent questions about cattle and did not pretend to know more than she did. She had a direct, level quality to her attention when she listened that made him aware, in a way he was not usually aware, of whether what he was saying was actually worth saying. 31 head is not enough to make the ranch pay, he said, when she asked him what she needed to know about her cattle situation. You need at least 70 to 80 to run a viable operation with costs factored in, especially given the capital you'll need to put into the property itself. How does one acquire more cattle without the capital to buy them outright? She asked. Some ranchers will lease breeding stock and take payment from the increase, he said. Others will take a share of the first drive in lieu of payment. It's a credit arrangement, essentially, based on trust and the expectation of future return. Would anyone extend that trust to a woman rancher they have never met? He thought about it honestly. Some would and some wouldn't, depends on the person. Would you? The question was direct and not coy, and it caught him in the solar plexus in a way he did not entirely expect. He met her eyes, which were very clear and steady, and said, I think I might. Santiago looked at his apple. Pete started to say something and Santiago put a hand on his arm. By the end of the first week, the well was operational. One section of the north fence had been repaired, and the front 2 rooms of the house were clean enough to be habitable, though the window opening still wanted glass. Eliza had slept in town at the Sadler house and ridden out each day, But on Friday evening, she told Mrs. Sadler that she would not be needing the room past Sunday, because she intended to move into the property. Mrs. Sadler, who was a practical woman herself, said, "The shutters will keep the cold out if you wedge them tight," and helped her pack. On Sunday, Cole helped her move her 2 trunks to the Calloway property in his wagon, which was a large, solid, well-maintained wagon pulled by a matched pair of bay horses that Eliza noticed were exceptionally well-kept animals. She stored this observation alongside several other observations she had been making, chiefly that, for a man who appeared to have very little, Cole Whittaker seemed to have access to quite a lot. His hands deferred to him in the way that men defer to employers rather than to fellow laborers. He knew the land with the specificity of someone who owns land rather than works on it. He had an air of settled authority about him that was quiet but real. She had thought, initially and automatically, that his torn coat meant poverty. She was beginning to wonder if she had gotten something wrong. She did not ask directly because it was not her business and because she was finding that she liked talking to him too much to risk making it awkward with a prying question. "You do not have to stay and help," she told him when he had carried the second trunk inside and was looking at the window situation with the assessing eye of a man forming a plan. "I know I don't," he said. "I only mean that I am not your responsibility." He turned and looked at her. "I know that too." There was a silence that was not uncomfortable, which was itself notable, because silences between people who have only known each other a week are usually at least slightly charged with uncertainty. "I will bring glass for the windows on Tuesday," he said. "Marcus has some at the store." "I will pay for the glass," she said firmly. "I know you will," he said, and there was a small curve at the corner of his mouth that was not quite a smile but was related to one. He came back Tuesday with the glass, and the following Thursday with a length of lumber for the window frames, and the Thursday after that he simply rode over, because he had been thinking about the rear section of the house, and had an idea about the wall, which could be stabilized more cheaply than a full rebuild if they used the remaining stone from the collapsed section as a foundation for a new partial wall, and roofed it with corrugated tin rather than attempting to match the original construction. "It won't be beautiful," he said, showing her the rough drawing he had made on the back of an old letter. "It will be functional," she said, studying it. "That is considerably more important." "I think so too," he said. They were standing close together at the kitchen table looking at the drawing, and the kitchen was small, and it occurred to Cole with sudden clarity that he had been finding more reasons to come to the Calloway property than there were strictly legitimate reasons to find. He stepped back slightly, not from discomfort exactly, but from the awareness of a feeling he had not planned on and was not yet sure what to do with. He was a man of 30 years who had been fully and honestly occupied by his ranch for most of his adult life. He had not been lonely precisely, because loneliness requires a sense of something missing, and he had not often let himself feel that. But lately, in the evenings when he sat on his own porch and looked at his own well-ordered landscape, he found himself thinking about gray eyes and firm handshakes, and the way a woman could look at a ruined back wall and say, "It will be functional," and make that sound like a form of hope. He was also, in the back of his mind, still operating on the assumption that she had resources he did not know about. The ease with which she carried herself, the quality of her speech and her bearing, the fact that she had come from St. Louis where life had a certain texture of civilization, all of it suggested to him a woman who had left comfort to take on this adventure as a choice rather than a necessity. He was cautious about this assumption in a way he could not entirely articulate, because the difference between a woman who has chosen difficulty and a woman who is struggling with difficulty changes the nature of what help means and whether it is welcome. He was wrong, and Eliza knew he was wrong, but she was not yet ready to tell him why. She was managing, which was different from thriving. She had sold 4 of the weakest cattle to a buyer in town named Pharaoh who dealt in stock and paid fair prices, and she had used the money to cover her immediate costs and pay Santiago and Pete what she owed them from the first week. She had a small amount left, enough to get through another 6 weeks if she was careful. After that, she needed the ranch to begin producing something. What she was discovering was that 31 cattle and 400 acres, and a woman alone, constituted a management problem that no amount of intelligence and education entirely solved without experience, physical help, and time. She was learning fast because she had always learned fast, and she was asking questions at every opportunity. Cole was her most frequent and most useful source of information, and she was aware that she was taking up his time and his expertise with a regularity that a proud woman might have felt embarrassed by. She felt something, but it was not quite embarrassment. It was a more complicated thing, an awareness of his generosity that was mixed with the desire to deserve it, and underneath both of those, something warmer that she was not yet naming. The spring was beautiful in a way that surprised her. She had not expected to be moved by landscape, not in a practical way, but the territory in April and May had a quality of light in the late afternoon that she found genuinely stunning, a gold that came through the brown grass and the distant juniper and turned everything amber and soft, and she would sometimes stand on her fixed porch with a cup of tea and watch the light change and feel, beneath all the difficulty and exhaustion, something that she could only describe as rightness. The feeling of being where she was supposed to be. Cole rode over one Saturday morning in early May with 2 of his hands and a wagon loaded with materials for the rear wall, and by the end of the day the wall was up, rough but solid, and the corrugated tin was on the roof, and the room behind it, while not beautiful, was protected from the weather and gave her a genuine back room that she could use for storage and eventually for other purposes. They ate supper on the porch that evening, all 4 of them, Eliza having cooked a proper meal over the now functional kitchen stove that Marcus Whitmore had helped her acquire second-hand from a family who had moved on from Dust Creek toward California. It was beans and cornbread and dried apple pie, and it was not fancy, but the air was warm and the sky was throwing pink and orange across the clouds, and Santiago played 3 songs on a small harmonica he carried in his coat pocket. And it was, by any honest measure, one of the better evenings Cole could remember in a long time. He stayed after the hands had ridden back, not because it was planned but because Eliza had poured 2 cups of coffee and set one on the porch railing nearest him, and they had both simply remained, watching the last light leave the sky. "You've done a good deal of work here," he said, "more than most people would have managed." "I had considerable help," she said. "The determination is yours." She looked at her coffee cup. "Do you ever wonder about the choices that brought you somewhere?" "I didn't choose to be here," he said. "I was born here." "Does it feel like a choice, though, to stay?" He thought about it. "Every day it does, I suppose. You could always go. Anyone can always go." He looked at the darkening hills. "But this land feels like mine in a way that's more than just deed and title. My father's in this ground. My grandfather built the first water line from the creek. When I walk a fence line, I know every post because I helped set half of them." He paused. "Does that sound like I'm bragging?" "It sounds like you're explaining what it means to belong to a place," she said. "I have not felt that before. I am beginning to understand it, though." "About this place specifically." She looked at him sideways, and the evening light was doing something to her face that he was aware of with a specificity that was not casual. "About this place specifically," she said. He looked away at the horizon, because looking at her when she said things like that with that steady voice was becoming something he had to make an active decision about. "Eliza," he said, and then did not immediately continue. "Yes." Her voice was careful and soft. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. I generally try to." He turned to look at her. "Are you all right here, financially, I mean? Are you managing?" She was quiet for a moment, and in that quiet he saw the thing he had been half seeing for weeks, the careful composure that was not quite ease, the management of a situation rather than the confidence of a cushion. "I am managing," she said, and it was not a lie, but it was the minimum version of the truth. "Eliza." "I have enough," she said, "for a while longer. After that, I need the ranch to begin producing, and I believe it can. You've been letting me think you had resources." "I have not said anything either way," she said with quiet precision. He looked at her. "No, you haven't." He thought about it. "Why?" She was quiet for a longer moment. "Because I did not want to be a project," she said. "I wanted to be a neighbor, and I was not sure I could trust that you would treat me as the latter if you knew I was the former." The honesty of it was clean and direct and slightly devastating. He sat with it for a moment. "I want you to know something," he said. "I have not been coming out here because I thought you needed rescuing. I've been coming out here because—" He stopped. "Because," she said softly, "because this is where I want to be," he said. "The work is an excuse, a good one and genuinely useful, but an excuse." The silence that followed was different from the earlier silences, fuller, the way air feels before something changes. "Cole," she said, and his name in her mouth was a new thing, deliberate and careful. "I have thought you poor from the first moment I saw you." He blinked. "I am sorry. Your coat," she said, and there was the beginning of a smile on her face. "It is very worn." He looked down at his coat. "It's a good coat." "It is entirely falling apart. It has character. It has holes." "One hole," he said, "and a few patches." "4 patches," she said, "and I counted." He stared at her, and then something broke loose in him that he had not realized was held, and he laughed. Not the polite, social laugh of a man being agreeable, but the real thing, the laugh that starts in the chest and has no performance in it. And it surprised him with its own force, and it surprised her too, because she smiled at it, a full smile, the first completely unguarded smile he had seen from her, and it rewrote his understanding of her face so comprehensively that he felt like he was seeing her for the first time. "I am not poor," he said, when he had recovered. "Not remotely." "I am beginning to suspect that," she said. "The matched bay horses were a significant clue." "What did you think? That I borrowed them? I considered it." "Eliza," he said, and the amusement and something deeper were mixed together in his voice. "The Iron Cross is 1,200 acres. I have been helping you because I wanted to, not because it cost me nothing to do so." "I know," she said, and she was serious now. The smile softened to something that was its emotional aftermath. "And I want you to know that it has meant a great deal more than I have said. I'm not always good at saying things like that. You are doing fairly well right now," he said. She looked at him with those clear gray eyes that did more than look, and he felt, with the certainty of a man who has found solid ground after uncertain terrain, that whatever was happening between them had been happening for weeks without his permission or hers and was now simply undeniable. "I'm going to say something," he said. "All right. I would like to call on you properly, if that is agreeable." She was quiet for a moment. "You have been calling on me practically every other day for a month." "Yes," he said, "but not properly, not with intention." "And now with considerable intention," he said. The smile came back to her face, slower this time and warmer, and she looked at her coffee cup and then back at him. "I think that would be agreeable," she said. The courtship, if it could be called that in any conventional sense, was conducted largely on horseback and porch steps, and in the middle of practical work, which was not the traditional form but suited them both better than candle-lit parlors would have. Cole rode over most mornings and worked alongside her, not doing the work for her but doing it beside her, and the difference was one that she recognized and valued. He taught her about the cattle with patience and specificity, explaining without condescension and correcting without superiority, and she absorbed the information with the quickness of an active mind, and applied it with the carefulness of someone who knows they are still learning. She in turn showed him things he did not know he had been missing. She read to him sometimes in the evenings, from the small stack of books she had brought from St. Louis, history and philosophy, and one novel that had been published the previous year, and that she felt strongly about. He was not a man who had ever thought much about reading as a social activity, having done it mostly alone, and hearing a book read aloud in a woman's voice in the warm air of a May evening on a porch in New Mexico was an entirely different thing than reading silently by lamplight, he found. He began to understand things about language and about the arrangement of words that he had not previously had access to. He told her about his father and the building of the Iron Cross, the years of it, the cattle drives to the railhead at Las Vegas, New Mexico, the winter of '79 that killed nearly a third of the territory's cattle, and had reduced his father to 3 months of desperation that Cole had watched as a 17-year-old and never entirely forgotten. His father had rebuilt, methodically and without self-pity, and Cole had learned more from watching that process than from anything else in his life. "He sounds like a man worth being made by," Eliza said when he had finished that story. "He was," Cole said. "He died 4 years ago. Fever." He paused. "I would have liked for him to meet you." She looked at him. It was the most directly personal thing he had said to her yet. "Why?" she asked, though she thought she knew. "Because he would have recognized you," Cole said. "He had a way of knowing people, what they were actually made of." He looked at the darkening sky. "He would have known you were going to make it here. I think he would have been glad about it." She said nothing for a moment because there was a thickness in her throat that surprised her. She had been largely alone for a long time, since her parents' death when she was 19, and the years of employment that followed, competent and self-sufficient, and carefully not requiring anything from anyone. Being seen, being spoken of as though she were a fixed point in someone's life rather than a capable but essentially transient presence, was a new sensation, and it was more powerful than she had expected. "Cole," she said. "Yes," she looked at him squarely. "I think I am in considerable danger of being very much in love with you." The statement hung in the warm air between them, clean and honest and a little breathtaking. He turned to look at her fully, and she met his gaze without retreating from it. "Eliza," he said slowly, "I have been in that danger since approximately the second time we spoke." "The second," she said, "not the first." "The first time I thought you were someone passing through," he said. "The second time I started understanding that you weren't going anywhere." She looked at him for a long moment, and then, in a movement that was measured and deliberate and entirely hers, she reached out and put her hand over his where it rested on the porch railing. He turned his hand over and held hers, and they sat like that in the descending evening, with the last purple light on the hills and the first stars appearing over the mountains and the sound of the cattle moving in the south pasture. And it was, she thought, exactly the kind of moment that the book she read described, and that she had half believed was a literary convention rather than an actual event. She had been wrong about that, too. June came in hot and brilliant, and the territory took on the particular quality of a summer in the Southwest, a gold and ochre intensity that was different from any other heat Eliza had known. The work on the ranch had reached a point where there was a system to it, enough that she could manage the daily rhythms without a crisis emerging at every turn. She was learning to read the cattle, to see the signs of illness before they became emergencies, to assess the water and the grazing with the intuitive judgment that comes from daily practice. She was not yet expert, but she was genuinely competent, and the distinction was one she took quiet pride in. Cole had arranged, as he had proposed weeks before, to lease her 20 head of breeding stock from the Iron Cross, an arrangement documented carefully with Prentice and designed so that the increase from the herd over the next 2 years would serve as payment. It was a fair deal, and one that several people in town knew about and approved of, and it had the practical effect of bringing the Callaway herd to 51 head, which was still not optimal but was considerably more viable than 31. What the town also knew, and discussed with the enthusiasm that small towns bring to the romantic arrangements of their residents, was that Cole Whitaker's horse was tied outside the Callaway property most mornings and often into the evenings, and that Eliza Callaway had been seen riding the Iron Cross fence lines with Cole on 2 separate occasions, and that when they were in town together, there was a quality of attention between them that required no particular interpretive skill to read. Mrs. Cordero, Cole's housekeeper, had opinions about this that she expressed at length and without being invited to do so. "She is a sensible woman, Mrs. Cordero told him on a Tuesday morning when he came in from an early start and she was making breakfast. "I have spoken to her 3 times in town. She is not frivolous." "I know," he said. "She is also not as well off as you seem to think she is." He looked at her. "I know that too." "Good," Mrs. Cordero said. "Then you are not under a misapprehension." She set his breakfast in front of him. "She has been doing very well with very little, and she has not complained about it to anyone, which I consider an excellent quality." "So do I," he said. "She is also, Mrs. Cordero continued, with the inexorability of someone who has been storing up observations, "clearly in love with you, which I consider a sign of considerable good judgment on her part." Cole said nothing, but he was aware that he was smiling at his breakfast plate. "You will do something about it properly," Mrs. Cordero said. "It was not a question." "I intend to," he said. He had, in fact, been thinking about intention quite specifically for the past 3 weeks. He had been thinking about it the way he thought about any significant undertaking, practically and from several angles, which was not perhaps the most romantic methodology, but was the one available to him. He had also been thinking about it at 2 in the morning on several occasions when he was not sleeping, which was considerably more romantic in its character. What he was thinking about, specifically, was a ring that had been his mother's, a simple gold band with a small turquoise stone set in it that she had chosen herself from a trader in Santa Fe, and that was currently in a wooden box in the top drawer of his bedroom dresser. He had looked at it twice in the past week and put it back both times, not because of doubt, which he did not feel, but because of the sense that the moment needed to be right, which in his case meant honest and direct rather than elaborate, because that was who he was and Eliza knew who he was, and he had not gotten this far by pretending to be otherwise. He chose a Sunday evening in late June. The day had been long and warm, and they had spent most of it together moving cattle between pastures on the Calloway property, a task that required 2 people and considerable patience, and resulted in a great deal of dust and occasional comedy. By the end of the afternoon, they were both thoroughly tired and somewhat grimy, and sitting on the porch drinking water from the tin cups that lived on the window ledge, and the mountains to the west were spectacular in the late light. Cole reached into his coat pocket, which he had not done at any point in the preceding 6 weeks without Eliza noticing, because he was a man of established habits, and the pocket usually contained a folding knife or a piece of fence wire, or occasionally a stub of pencil. What he brought out now was the wooden box. Eliza looked at it. He opened it. She looked at the ring, and the turquoise caught the late light and was a very clear, particular blue, the kind of blue that New Mexico made its own. "This was my mother's," he said. "She's been gone 15 years, fever also." He looked at the ring and then at Eliza. "She would have liked you, differently than my father would have, but just as much." "Cole," she said, and her voice was very quiet. "I am not going to make a long speech," he said. "You know me well enough by now to know I would make a bad job of it. But I want to say one thing." "All right," she said. "I have been happier in the past 2 months than I have been in a very long time, and it is entirely because you are here. Not because of your grace, which is considerable, and not because you are capable, which you are, but because you are you specifically, and I have no interest in any future that doesn't have you in the center of it." She looked at him with the clear gray eyes that always seemed to be doing more than looking, and they were bright with something that she was not quite going to let become tears because she was Eliza Calloway and she had standards about herself. "Yes," she said. "Yes. Yes, I will marry you," she said. Was that unclear? "I had not yet asked the question formally," he said. "You had the ring out," she said. "It was implied." He laughed, and she did too, a real laugh, clear and unguarded, and he took the ring out of the box and put it on her finger, and it fit, which felt like more than coincidence, and she looked at it on her hand with an expression that she could not entirely compose into steadiness, and he put his hand over hers the way she had put her hand over his on a different evening on this same porch. "The coat," she said after a moment. "What about it?" When I first saw you, I thought you were very poor. Because of the coat. I have been informed of this, he said. I thought about you as someone who was struggling, she said. And then when I realized I had it wrong, I thought about why I had not simply asked, and I realized it was because the assumption had already made me feel something, a kind of solidarity, and I did not want to give that up. He looked at her. What did you feel? That you were someone who understood what it was to work for things, she said. That you had not arrived anywhere with ease. That you and I were in some way in the same circumstance. She paused. Which we were in all the ways that matter, just not in the way I thought. I have always worked for things, he said. The fact that the things currently exist does not change the working. I know, she said. I know that now. And I thought you were wealthy, he said, because of your grace. My grace, she repeated, and the smile was genuine and warm. That is a very kind word for what I am doing. It is exactly the right word, he said. You carry yourself like someone who has never had to worry about the ground being solid. It took me longer than it should have to see that it was the opposite. That you had learned to walk like that because the ground had not always been solid, and you had decided it was going to be regardless. She was very quiet for a moment. That is the most accurate thing anyone has ever said about me, she said. I have been paying attention, he said. They were married in September, in the small church at the end of the main street of Dusk Creek, on a morning that was clear and cool, with the first suggestion of fall in the air. The church was full, because Dusk Creek was not a large town and a wedding was an event of consequence, and because Cole Whitaker was liked and respected throughout the county, and because Eliza Calloway had, in the 5 months since her arrival, managed to make herself genuinely necessary to the fabric of the place in ways that were not entirely predictable. She had started, quietly and without making an announcement about it, teaching 2 of the local children who had no access to formal schooling, the children of a Mexican family named Reyes who worked the cattle on a small homestead 3 miles south of town. The family had arrived 2 years before with the movement of workers that the territory's labor needs produced, and like many such families, they occupied an uncertain middle space in the social geography of Dusk Creek, not entirely welcomed by the Anglo establishment, and not entirely supported by the territorial government. The injustice of this was one that Eliza observed with clear eyes and spoke about with a directness that occasionally made people uncomfortable, and she considered their discomfort a reasonable price for the conversation. She had also begun corresponding with the County Education Board in Santa Fe about the possibility of a formal school in Dusk Creek, a project that was a long way from fruition, but that she had no intention of abandoning. Cole had known about this project for 3 months and had quietly donated a parcel of land on the edge of town for the eventual school building, a gesture that he had not mentioned to Eliza because he knew she would want to discuss whether he was sure about it. And he was sure about it and did not particularly need the discussion, though he told her afterward when it was already done, and she looked at him with an expression that was too many things at once for him to separate. The church ceremony was performed by a minister named Reverend Oakes, who had been in Dusk Creek for 12 years, and who had a gift for brevity in official settings that the congregation generally appreciated. Marcus and Clara Whitmore sat in the front row. Mrs. Cordero wore a dress that she had apparently been saving for an occasion, and which, she informed the minister beforehand, she intended to wear again when it was cold enough for a coat. Santiago and Pete sat together, and Pete cried a small amount at the vows, which Santiago pretended not to notice. The Reyes family sat on the right side of the church, in the spot that Eliza had specifically told Mrs. Oakes they would be occupying, because she was Eliza, and these were details that mattered. Cole wore a clean shirt and his good trousers and his hat, because he was a man who wore a hat, and he had, at Eliza's gentle suggestion, purchased a new coat for the occasion, a good brown canvas coat from the catalog that Marcus had ordered, and that was, to be fair, an excellent coat, well-made and well-fitting, and not yet beginning to show any of the endearing deterioration that characterized its predecessor. Eliza wore her plum dress, newly cleaned and pressed, and her traveling hat with a small addition of white ribbon that Mrs. Whitmore had helped her affix, and she walked down the aisle of the small church with the bearing that people had been noticing since she stepped off the stagecoach in April. That unperformed, self-contained grace that was, Cole now understood, the form that her particular kind of courage took in the world. He watched her come toward him and thought, with the clarity that moments of genuine importance sometimes produce, that he had no idea what the next years would look like in their specifics, what the cattle market would do, or what the weather would bring, or what difficulties would arrive in the shapes that difficulties take, but that he had no doubt whatsoever about the woman walking toward him, who she was, and what she was capable of, and what she was to him, and that those things together constituted a foundation solid enough to build anything on. The vows were said. The ring she already wore was joined by a second one he had bought, a plain gold band, and she put a plain gold band on his finger, and Reverend Oakes said the words that made them legally and formally what they had been becoming since April, and the church made the sound that small congregations make when something genuinely good has happened. They had a simple reception in the open area behind the church, tables set up with food that half the town had contributed, a fiddle player named Dawson who could play anything requested and several things that were not, and the afternoon was warm and golden, and the mountains were the particular blue of fall mountains, which is different from spring and summer mountains and more serious, and people ate and talked, and the children ran between the tables. Cole danced with Eliza 3 times, which for a man who did not consider himself a dancer was 3 more times than usual, but she had turned out to be a dancer, clear and precise and musical about it, and he found that following her was actually quite simple if he paid attention, which was a lesson he suspected had broader application. "Happy," he said, the 3rd time, and they were moving slowly to something Dawson was playing that was slower than the first 2. "Profoundly," she said, and it was the most complete answer he had ever received to any question. They drove to the Iron Cross that evening, because it was decided that the Callaway property would remain as a working satellite of the main ranch operation, the land and cattle managed as a unit with the Iron Cross resources, while the main house was developed further, and they would live at the Iron Cross. This was a decision Eliza had reached herself and proposed to Cole, because she was practical about property and unemotional about the attachment to the Callaway house, which had been rebuilt with her own effort but did not carry the same depth of meaning that the Iron Cross did for Cole. The Callaway land was valuable and she knew it. It would be managed well. But the Iron Cross was home in a way that the other property had not yet become. The house that she arrived at as its new mistress was more than she had expected, because Cole had somehow failed, across the summer, to convey its actual quality, partly because he was modest about his own situation, and partly because she had not asked and he had not pressed. It was a real house, solid adobe with a stone foundation, 4 rooms of good size with proper glass windows and solid furniture, a kitchen that had a wood range and a good chimney, a covered porch that ran along the front and one side, and a view of the western mountains that was, in the sunset of a September evening, entirely and simply extraordinary. "You have been living here this whole time," she said, standing on the porch and looking at the view. "Yes," he said. "While helping me fix a collapsed wall and a broken well. You needed the help." She turned and looked at him. "Cole." "Yes. I am going to be occasionally exasperated by your modesty," she said. "I want you to know that in advance. I will try to warn you," he said, "when it is coming." Mrs. Cordero had left a meal warming on the stove, and a note on the kitchen table that said simply, "Welcome home, Mrs. Whitaker," and a small vase of wild flowers from somewhere on the property that still had September color in them. And Eliza stood in the kitchen and looked at the note and the flowers for a long moment with an expression that was the fullest and most unguarded thing Cole had seen on her face. And he stood in the doorway and let her have the moment without interrupting it. That winter was hard in the way that New Mexico winters were sometimes hard. A cold snap in November that froze the water troughs and required daily braking. A stretch of 3 weeks in December with driving wind and temperatures that kept everyone close to the fires. They weathered it together, which was a different thing than weathering it alone. Cole had always been competent in difficult circumstances, but competent and alone had a quality of grinding persistence to it that competent together did not. Eliza learned the property's rhythms with the same systematic attention she brought to everything, and she absorbed the winter management of a large ranch with a thoroughness that impressed his hands and slightly worried him, because she worked too hard and rested too little, and when he said so she looked at him with an expression that suggested she considered the observation somewhat rich coming from him. "You were up at 4 this morning," she said. "The cattle. I know why you were up at 4, she said. "I was awake too. My point is that we cannot both run at this pace indefinitely." He looked at her. "Are you all right?" "I am entirely well," she said. "I am also, I believe, expecting our child, and I would appreciate it if we could discuss the pacing of the next 8 months with some rationality." The silence that followed was one of the most complete silences Cole had ever inhabited, and then he moved across the kitchen and took her face in his hands and looked at her with an expression that had several things in it, none of them anything except good. "When?" he managed. "July, I believe," she said. "I spoke to the doctor last week." "Last week," he said, "and you are telling me now." "I wanted to be certain," she said, "and I wanted to tell you properly, not in passing." "Eliza," he said. "Yes." He put his forehead against hers. "I am going to reduce the pace somewhat," he said. "For my own reasons entirely." "That is entirely reasonable," she said, and she was smiling, and he could feel it against his face. The spring was magnificent. The Callaway property, managed now as part of the Iron Cross operation with Santiago overseeing the cattle there 3 days a week, was flourishing in a modest but genuine way, and the combined herd was performing well. Eliza had resumed her teaching efforts with the Ray's children, and had added 2 more students, the children of a widow named Mrs. Garza, who had moved to the area in November, and the County Education Board in Santa Fe had sent a letter in March, indicating that the case for a formal school in Dusk Creek was being reviewed, which she took as progress and described to Cole in terms that made clear she was treating it as a promise. In April, she received a letter from a school board representative named Mr. Alderton, who wanted to visit Dusk Creek in May to assess the situation. She wrote back a response that was precise, persuasive, and left no useful counterargument on the table, and Cole read it over her shoulder and said, "He is going to say yes." "He is going to say yes," she agreed. Mr. Alderton came in May and said yes, pending formal application and a review process that was bureaucratic in character and would take some months. Eliza thanked him with the specific, energized graciousness of someone who intends to make the review process as short as the regulations allow. Cole watched the whole proceeding from a respectful distance, because he had learned over the winter and spring that Eliza's causes were best supported by resources and a certain strategic silence rather than by participation, partly because she was better at the thing than he would be, and partly because she was committed to the principle that the school be understood as a community resource rather than a wealthy rancher's charity, a distinction she felt strongly about. He donated the land and kept his involvement quiet, which she knew about and appreciated without requiring him to perform modesty about it. The baby came in late June, 2 weeks earlier than expected, which produced a compressed period of activity in the house that Mrs. Cordero managed with the efficiency of someone who has been waiting to take charge of exactly this situation. Dr. Hensley rode out from town and arrived with enough time to be useful, and the whole proceeding, while not easy, went well in the essential sense of that word. A boy. Cole was outside with the hands when Mrs. Cordero came to the porch and told him, and he went inside and looked at his son, who was red-faced and emphatically vocal and already seemed to have opinions about his circumstances. And then he looked at Eliza, who was exhausted and brilliant and holding the child with the particular competence of someone who has decided to be good at this immediately. "Hello," she said to the baby, with a softness that was different from her other voices. "We have been waiting for you." "He came early," Cole said, sitting on the edge of the bed and looking at his son. "He has good instincts," Eliza said. "Better to arrive before you are expected than to keep people waiting." Cole put his hand on the baby's head, which was very small and warm, and felt something that did not have a word that was adequate to it. "What do we call him?" They had discussed names without reaching a conclusion, which was more or less where most of their discussions ended because they were both people who wanted to see the actual thing before deciding how to name it. "James," she said, "after your father." He looked at her. "You never met him." "I know him from your stories," she said. "He was a man worth naming a son after." Cole was quiet for a moment, and the quiet had depth and weight and gratitude in it, and he said, "James." And the name settled into the room like something that had always been going to happen. James Whittaker grew up on the Iron Cross with the particular advantages of a child who has two parents who are fully present and who treat the world as a serious and interesting place. He was a direct, curious child who was walking confidently at 11 months and talking in full sentences at 2 years, which Cole attributed to Eliza and Eliza attributed to environment, and neither of them was willing to accept the credit fully. The school in Dusk Creek was formally approved in the fall of 1883, which was to say that the funding was promised, and the application was approved, with construction to begin in the spring. It was a single-room schoolhouse on the land that Cole had donated, built to a standard plan from a county blueprint, and it opened in September of 1884 with 12 students ranging from 6 to 14 years old, and a teacher named Miss Hollies who had trained in Albuquerque. Eliza had fought for the location, the funding, the inclusion of the Reyes and Garza children in the enrollment list without qualification, and the appointment of a qualified teacher rather than a makeshift arrangement. And she had won every one of those fights with the methodical, gracious persistence of someone who has decided that the outcome is not in question, only the timeline. She attended the opening day with James on her hip and Cole beside her, and she stood in the doorway of the new schoolhouse and looked at the 12 children filing in with their slates and their expressions of uncertain excitement, and the satisfaction of it was something she felt in her bones. "Well done," Cole said quietly beside her. "Well done to all of us," she said. "You donated the land." "You built the case," he said. "We did it together," she said, and looked at him sideways, "which is what we do." He looked back at her with that expression she had come to know over 2 years and still found new things in, the warm, direct, unperforming look of a man who is where he intends to be. In the fall of 1884, Douglas Fenwick made a final attempt to purchase the eastern strip of Iron Cross land that he had been pursuing for 3 years. He sent a formal letter through Prentice, offering a sum that was higher than his previous offers and accompanied by a legal argument about road access rights that was not entirely meritless. Cole read it at the kitchen table with Eliza. "What do you think?" he said. "I think the road access argument is creative but thin," she said, having read it twice with the focused attention of someone who has spent time with legal documents. "I think the price is fair for the land itself, but does not account for what the access would be worth to him once he has it, and I think he will not pursue it in court because the cost and uncertainty are not worth it to him. So you think I should decline?" "I think you should decline," she said. "The land is worth more than he is offering. More importantly, the access it provides him would change the character of the road through our north section, and I am not comfortable with that." She paused. "It is your land, your decision." "It's our land," he said. She looked at him. "Yes," she said, "it is." He declined, formally and politely, and Fenwick grumbled and moved on to other investments, and the matter was closed. That winter was milder than the previous one, and they passed it with the comfortable rhythm of people who have found their pace together. Cole had settled into a pattern of management that included Eliza in the decisions of the ranch in a way that was not common for the time and that he had arrived at naturally, because she was better at some things than he was, and he was not the kind of man who required his own superiority more than he required good outcomes. She managed the books and the cattle counts and the correspondence with buyers, and had an instinct for prices and markets that turned out to be genuinely useful in practical terms. She also taught James, who at 18 months was too young for the schoolhouse but not too young for his mother's kitchen table, and her patient, clear-voiced explanations of everything she saw around them. He had dark eyes like his father and something in the set of his jaw that was clearly Eliza's and her mother's before her, a quality of having already decided about things. In the spring of 1885, Eliza told him they were expecting again, and this time he was there when she arrived at the decision to tell him, sitting at the breakfast table, and he looked at her across the table for a long moment. "July again," he said. "August this time," she said. "The doctor thinks late August." "A summer child," he said. "Two of them if this continues," she said. "Does that concern you?" she considered. "No," she said honestly. "I find I like the summer children. They arrive with the heat and they have good energy." He laughed and reached across the table and took her hand. Their second child, a daughter, was born in August of 1885 on a morning when a thunderstorm had come through the night before and left the air scrubbed clean and the mountains sharp against the sky. She came into the world considerably less dramatic than James had, which Eliza noted with an air of professional comparison, and she was dark-haired and quiet-eyed, and regarded everything around her from the first hours with a thoughtful assessment that made both her parents look at each other and then back at her. "Clara," Eliza said, "for Mrs. Whitmore, if you agree." Cole looked at his daughter, who was looking back at him with the serious gray eyes she had inherited, and that on her face were entirely new. "Clara," he said, "yes, Mrs. Whitmore, when informed, pressed her handkerchief to her mouth and composed herself with considerable effort, and then said that it was an honor and that Clara Whitmore had been born in Illinois 72 years ago and was glad to pass the name to someone who would do something worthwhile with it. Life on the Iron Cross settled into the shape that good lives settle into, not without difficulty, because the land and the cattle and the weather and the market were never entirely obliging for long, but with the foundational solidity of two people who had built something together and knew what it was worth and how it had been made. The autumn after Clara was born, they rode the full fence line of the Iron Cross together, all 4 sections, Cole and Eliza, over 2 days, with James bundled against the October cold in a carrier on Cole's saddle, and Clara left for the 2 days with Mrs. Cordero, who had been preparing for exactly this responsibility for months. It was the kind of ride that shows you a property whole, the good sections and the ones that need attention, the views from the North Ridge that made you understand why the land mattered, the creek that ran in the west section that was the reason his grandfather had originally chosen this particular piece of ground. Cole knew every foot of it the way he knew his own hands, and riding it with Eliza, who had been learning it for 3 years now and who asked precise questions about each section's management history, was a different experience than riding it alone had ever been. It was richer, more specifically real. They stopped at noon on the North Ridge with the mountains ahead of them and the ranch below and ate the lunch Mrs. Cordero had packed, and James had fallen asleep against Cole's chest in the way that small children fall asleep, completely and without negotiation. "Cole," Eliza said. "Yes," he said, watching the mountains. "I want to tell you something I should have said more plainly before now." "All right." She looked at him with the clear gray eyes that he had been looking into for 3 years and that still, at 3 years, could show him new things. "I came here because of a piece of land I had never seen, belonging to a man I barely knew, in a place I had never been, because I was 24 years old and the life I was living felt like someone else's," she said. I thought I was coming to build something for myself, and I was. But I did not know that the building would turn out to be us. I did not know that the thing I was actually coming toward was you and this family and this land in this particular way." He looked at her. "I want you to know that I am grateful for it," she said. "For all of it. For the well and the back wall and the borrowed cattle and the ring. For the evenings on the porch and the mornings when James woke us both up at 5 and neither of us had slept enough. For the school and the fence line and the way you look at this land and the way you looked at me when you first saw me in the street." She paused. "I was not expecting any of it. I was not expecting you. And it is the best thing that has ever happened to me." He was quiet for a moment, and James shifted in his sleep against his father's chest, and the mountains sat against the sky in the way that mountains do, which is to say, without any awareness of their own significance. "Eliza," he said, "I want to tell you something also." "Yes," she said. "You arrived in a torn-up town in a plum dress and you looked like you owned the air," he said. "And I thought you were rich and I thought you were passing through. And then you stayed. And every day you stayed you became more completely a part of this place. And every day I understood more clearly that what I had mistaken for wealth was simply you, the way you are, which is the most considerable thing I have encountered in my life." He looked at her squarely. "I am a man who does not spend words easily, so I want you to know that every one of those is meant." She held his gaze for a long moment, and the clarity in her eyes had warmth behind it that was entirely genuine and entirely hers. "I know they are," she said. Below them, the Iron Cross lay in the October light, the main house with its smoke from the kitchen chimney, the barns and the outbuildings and the corrals, the cattle visible as moving shapes in the south pasture, the road that ran from the gate to the main track toward Dusk Creek. From up here you could also see in the middle distance the roofline of the Calloway property, the repaired house with its corrugated tin section that caught the light differently from the rest, the well with its new assembly, the fence lines that had been rebuilt section by section. "I see our whole life from here," Eliza said. "Most of it," Cole said. "The rest of it is ahead." She looked at the mountains and then back at him, and she was smiling with the full warmth of a woman who has arrived where she is going. "The rest of it is ahead," she agreed. The years that followed had the texture of years that are lived fully, which means that they contained joy and work and occasional hardship in the natural proportions that life provides, and they were met by two people who had built their foundation carefully and knew what it was capable of holding. The school in Dusk Creek grew from 12 students to 22 by 1887, when a second room was added to the building and a second teacher was hired. Eliza sat on the school board, which she had advocated into existence, and she fought for the curriculum with the same patient, relentless energy she brought to everything she cared about, which meant it included arithmetic and reading and geography and history, and did not discriminate on the basis of family name or country of origin. The Ray's family, whose children she had first taught in an informal arrangement on her own property, now had 3 children in the school and another coming, and Miguel Ray's had become one of the most reliable hands on the Iron Cross, a development that Cole considered one of the better outcomes of the whole sequence of events. James learned to ride at 3½, sitting in front of his father on the big bay horse and later, with careful supervision, on a small, patient mare named Daisy that Cole selected with a specificity that suggested considerable prior thought. Clara watched her brother with gray eyes that catalogued everything and waited until she was old enough to make her own case, which she did at age 3, with an argument that Eliza later described to Cole as more persuasive than most adult petitions she had read. In 1880, 8 Cole extended the Iron Cross north, purchasing an adjacent parcel of 300 acres from a family named Stacy who had decided to move to California. It brought the total to 1,500 acres and required a significant draw on the bank account in Santa Fe. But the land was good, and the price was fair, and the timing worked, and it was the kind of growth that the ranch had been moving toward for years. Eliza managed the financing with the steady competence that had characterized her management of everything. And when the deal was done and they sat down in the evening with the papers signed and the deed recorded and a cup of coffee on the table between them, she looked at the numbers and said, "Your grandfather would be pleased." "My grandfather would think I overpaid," Cole said. "Your grandfather," she said, "would think you made a wise investment and would not say so directly because he was a man who showed satisfaction through action rather than words." She looked at him over the top of her coffee cup, which is a quality that runs in the family. He looked at her with the expression that had not changed in 6 years, the warm and direct and unperforming look. "Am I that obvious?" he said. "To me," she said. "Only to me." In 1889, the New Mexico Territory held its constitutional convention, preparing for the long-anticipated push toward statehood, and Cole was asked by a delegation from Dust Creek and the surrounding area to attend as a representative, given that he was one of the more established and respected ranchers in the county. He went to Santa Fe for 2 weeks, which was the longest he and Eliza had been apart since their marriage, and he wrote her letters of a quality that surprised him, because he was not a natural writer of letters, but she was the kind of person that language gathered itself for. She wrote back with the precision and warmth that characterized everything she did, and included in her third letter a piece of news that he read standing in the hallway of the hotel in Santa Fe with the morning light coming through the window. They were expecting again. He was home 3 days earlier than planned. Their third child, a son they named Howard, arrived in the spring of 1890, named for the uncle whose inheritance had brought Eliza to New Mexico Territory in the first place, the private man she had barely known who had, in leaving her a collapsed house and 31 cattle and a broken well, changed the entire trajectory of her life. The name was a form of gratitude, quiet and specific, the way gratitude often is when it is genuine. Howard was a different sort of child from his siblings, rounder and more peaceful, with Cole's coloring and Eliza's equanimity, and he slept through the night at 6 weeks, which James had not managed until 4 months, and which Clara had achieved at 3 weeks, but only because she had decided to, not because she was actually peaceful about anything. Howard simply seemed to find the world agreeable, and he regarded it with a calm contentment that both his parents found touching and slightly incredible. "He is the easiest child I have ever encountered," Mrs. Cordero said, holding him on a Tuesday morning with the authority of someone who has held a significant number of children. "It cannot last." "Perhaps he is simply like this," Eliza said. "No one is simply like this," Mrs. Cordero said. "He is gathering himself." Howard remained, however, a person of considerable good nature throughout his early years, which did not preclude him from eventually having opinions and expressing them with the directness that his parentage would predict, but which meant that the household of 3 children on the Iron Cross, while lively, was not chaotic. And the evenings when all 3 were in bed and Cole and Eliza sat on the covered porch with the summer night around them, had a quality of earned peace that is one of the more specific and irreplaceable forms of happiness. The old coat finally gave up in the winter of 1890. Not dramatically, not in one catastrophic failure, but in the way of things that have been used fully. The left sleeve came loose at the shoulder in a way that was no longer repairable, and the right side pocket, which had been patched twice, came apart entirely, and Mrs. Cordero found it on the back porch where Cole had left it after a morning of fence work and simply looked at it for a long moment. When she told Eliza, Eliza went to look at it herself. She stood with the coat in her hands in the back porch light and looked at it, at the 8-year accumulation of patches and repairs and worn edges and fraying cuffs, and she thought about a dusty street in April of 1882, and a man leaning against a post with his arms folded and his hat pulled low, and the automatic and entirely wrong assumption she had made about who he was, and all the things that had followed from the accidental correction of that assumption. She folded the coat carefully and put it in a wooden box on the back porch shelf because it seemed wrong to throw it away, and she went inside and told Cole. He was quiet for a moment. "That coat was a good coat," he said. "It was," she agreed. "I've had it since I was 22. "I know," she said. "The new one is also a good coat. It will develop character in time." He looked at her with the slight curve at the corner of his mouth that she had loved since the first time she saw it, which was very early and which she had not immediately admitted to herself. "You kept it," he said. "In a box on the back porch," she said. "I could not quite let it go." "Why?" She thought about it. "Because it is where we started," she said. "Your coat and my Grace and two people who had each other entirely wrong and turned out to be exactly right." He looked at her for a long moment. The morning light was coming through the kitchen window, and it was 1890, and they had 3 children and 1,500 acres, and a school that was growing and a ranch that was working. And the woman standing in front of him was the same woman who had stepped off a stagecoach in the spring of his 30th year with 2 trunks and $112.30, and the particular kind of courage that looks, from the outside, like grace. He crossed the kitchen and put his hands on either side of her face and kissed her in the straightforward and unhurried way of a man who has been kissing his wife for 8 years and intends to continue for considerably longer. And she put her hands over his the way she had on the first evening they sat on her porch, and the stars came out over the mountains, and the kitchen was warm and the children were somewhere in the house being themselves, and the Iron Cross was everything it had become, and it was enough. It was, in the fullest sense of that word, everything. Outside, the New Mexico morning was doing the thing that New Mexico mornings did, which was to fill the world with a light that had no equal, gold and clear and vast, pouring down from the mountains and across the grasslands and into the corrals and the barns, and along the fence lines that ran to every corner of the property, touching the old well that had been repaired, and the porch that had been rebuilt, and the schoolhouse in the middle of town, and the headstones in the church cemetery that included his father's name and the Calloway name, and all the other names of people who had shaped this particular piece of the world. The cattle were moving in the south pasture. Santiago was already at the Calloway property. Pete, now married with a child of his own and living in a small house on the Iron Cross property, was saddling up in the barn. Mrs. Cordero was starting the bread. James would be awake soon and would want to know if he could ride out today, and Clara would want whatever James wanted but with modifications of her own specification, and Howard would observe the whole proceeding from the calm center of his particular nature. All of it was ordinary, which is another word for the extraordinary thing that happens when a life has reached the shape it was always reaching toward. Cole stepped back and looked at his wife, and she looked at him with the gray eyes that had never stopped being the most alive thing in any room she occupied. "Ready?" he said. "Ready," she said, and the day began.